Welcome, Helen. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you and your panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panel of the day. The topic is navigating youth to adulthood. When do you ask for help and what I learned? And this is going to be moderated by Helen Courier. Helen Courier has over 4 decades of renal healthcare experience at a quaternary care pediatric and women's healthcare system. Her publications include a book, chapters and pediatric and women's health, and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Her varied nursing experiences have brought her to the realization that the arts and healthcare are an important supplement to drug or technology-based treatment. She also believes in the benefits of exercise and has led transplant recipient participation in transplant games domestically and abroad since 2011. Helen has a long history of professional volunteerism with the goal of applying lessons learned from evidence-based practice outcomes to mold international standards and guidelines. Welcome, Helen. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. One of the privileges that I've had in my career is really to take care of people with kidney disease from birth and now before birth. So oftentimes we are involved with fetal intervention surgery. But definitely by birth and then until adulthood. And hopefully beyond that, I keep my contacts with all of those children that I've had the privilege to take care of. So, when I first started, to disclose a little bit, it was back in 1980, and we didn't think a lot about transitioning then because we were really focused on keeping children alive. That was, our major focus, and we really celebrated when, patients were successful. And then as medicine became more advanced, and honestly, we grew with that. We grew in our understanding of what the population that we cared for, what the support that they really needed. Whether or not, like, how we supplemented school, how we supported school, and then what did you need to be as an adult? What did you need to be successful as an adult? Because, I'm afraid that the first time probably any of us thought about it, and this was early, in the 80s, that someone said, we have your patient, and your patient, doesn't understand all these things. And then we realize how much we, in pediatrics, we advocate and we do a lot of support. We do a lot of support. And in adult care, one has to advocate for themselves. And what part did we own in preparing children that became young adults to transition to adulthood in adult care? And so, probably maybe 15 years ago, we started to really see transitioning programs come together, and you'll see some with modules that start, with transitioning where I consider kind of latent, maybe around 16. And transitioning is whenever you prepare. That's a distinction from transfer. So whenever you think about transfer, that's whenever, your payer, your insurance company, oftentimes, because it's not Medicare, but some private insurers say, as of now, you require treatment in an adult facility. And so, unfortunately, in the past, many hospitals were not ready for that. It's only been like managed care, again, maybe 15, at the most 20 years. But so you think about it, people have modular programs like, oh, I wonder whenever they would understand. Well, maybe they would understand whenever they were, 16, and we could start to teach about some of this self-care and the more. And this is my personal journey. There are a lot of transition programs. It's interesting because the chief of pediatric nephrology at Lurie Children's actually has an abstract about transitioning at the American Society of Nephrology Congress. And just so that you know, that's a world, it's international. It'll be in San Diego this year. It's really a big deal. So for that to be, a poster topic is means that it's germane. It's out there, and from what I've seen, just the first blush of what she discovered is that there's not a lot of consistency, right? And so I'm looking forward to talking to her more and hearing more about that research.
Yeah, and you bring up transition to care, Helen. I just want to interrupt really quick to maybe give a maybe Jorge and Mihi can talk a little bit about how they experienced that transition from pediatric to adult care and just anything they might have learned in that process or advice that they can give to others who might be going through that right now. Mihi, maybe do you want to share a little bit about your experience?
Yes, hi. I'm Mihi. So I got sick when I was 11 years old, and I did dialysis then, and then got the transplant and went through rejections. It was difficult, but then they told us 18 wasn't the transition period, which I thought originally was, but that 21 was, and which made it a little bit easier to transition from pediatrics to adults. And one thing I learned is that I had to speak up for myself. I had to learn to speak up for myself and advocate for my health. And I had to tell myself that, okay, well, you know what? If I'm not feeling well, I have to be able to say that rather than expect it just to be coming naturally. It was a little bit of a difficult transition because um I had to deal with all these doctors, dialysis, and then changing clinics and changing doctors, and then changing from pediatrics to adults was different because I didn't understand much then. I didn't have the resources I have now. I didn't have the education I have now. That's when I reached out to several different organizations, tried to volunteer, tried to be part of organizations in order to educate myself on what kidney disease is, the different type of treatments and different um, the transplantation process and everything. And it was a journey, and I'm grateful that I had so many support systems and also the resources that I had after I transitioned to the adult. Um, it yeah, it was. I'm grateful for that experience.
Great, thank you for sharing, Mihi. Jorge, do you want to add anything about your experience?
Let's see. Mihi pretty much covered most of it, but I didn't for me it was a lot of trial and error transition because there weren't really transition programs. So I transferred over from pediatric dialysis over to adult dialysis when I was about 17. And it wasn't until I got into community college that I started to learn more about biology, anatomy, physiology that helped me find my voice to try to and educate myself so I could collaborate with doctors. But even that wasn't enough because the physician that I had at the time, he would not, he wouldn't, we would butt heads a lot. And I remember taking an intro to chemistry course just for the sole purpose of trying to make a point with him. But, and of course, I failed that course. Um, and I eventually met an individual who managed to navigate dialysis as an adult. And what I learned was that the care that one receives on dialysis in a pediatric unit is significantly better than what you receive as an adult. So I basically used myself as a guinea pig. increasing the amount of time I spent on dialysis, changing my diet, and occasionally messing with my binders by slowly reintroducing some of the foods I enjoyed, which include dairy. So I would take my binders, and if I had something with dairy, I would take an extra one. And I did somewhat similar with when I had issues with my blood pressure. I started exercising, and as soon as I started getting back into shape after losing my third kidney, those blood pressure medications I had to pretty much cut them out because my blood pressure was dropping. And I've pretty much managed that way, just trial and error, trying to learn as much as possible and finding job.
That's super important. Thank you, Jorge.
Yep.
And thank you again, Mihi, for sharing. And Helen, I think Lori maybe posed a question that you could touch on in the chat. How do you start the discussion to help kids who failed to transition?
Well, I just wanted to mention that I've I've interacted like with Helen with a lot of youth who are transitioning, and I see it in two different categories. I see one category where in my family is my mom had no problem me taking over my care. In fact, she needed me to because she had some problems herself. And so the doctors and nurses early on always talked to me, like they always made me part of the decision. And then I've seen another side of where a parent, wants to care for their child and wants to do everything for their child. And includes uh, not letting the kid participate because they want to make all the decisions. And that is a very fine line because we don't always make the same decisions that our parents make. And so there has to be this time when the healthcare professional, the parent, and the child, you ask the child what's important to them. Because when I was growing up, and I don't know if Mihi or Jorge had the same problem, but a lot of people didn't have expectations of me. It was just to get through the day, the treatment. Everything was focused on the treatment. I was thinking, well, I want to go party and I used to get blood transfusions a lot. So I always liked to organize my blood transfusions before I was going somewhere. And I mean, so it's very interesting, but I had different goals. I didn't want the blood right now. I wanted it next week when I'd feel better. So this was my way of trying to understand what I needed to live the life I wanted to live. And luckily, I had healthcare professionals that listened to me. But at times, I'll recall a conversation when I was the first child to go on PD. And I was, on the cycler with a 10-foot cord, right? I'm like, that doesn't work for me. I need 20 feet. And I put another cord in, I just did it, I mean, this is what we do. I just added one. And they're like, oh my God, you can't do that. You can't because it's not going to get dialyzed, that fluid. It's extra supplies. And I'll never forget, my nurse said, why are you doing it? Why? And I said, because I don't want to be limited when my friends come over. I want to feel normal where I can walk and sit and watch a movie and not have to roll everything around because I want to make sure I get dialysis. So she heard me that she said, well, we either let this young girl use the other extension, the two, or she's not going to do her dialysis at home. And that was, I mean, that might have been a possibility that I might not have gotten on dialysis till later in the night after my friends were gone. So I think these discussions are really important. You know what I'm saying? Why do you want to do something? Why do you want to go to class, Jorge? Me, you know what I mean? Because no, I want to prove my doctor wrong. I love that one. And I'm going to get the knowledge to tell him. And I think a doctor my doctor would be absolutely thrilled that I tried to come back and give him my perspective on something. You know, he's up for the debate, but perhaps some doctors just sometimes want you to follow their orders. And I think pediatric doctors are a little bit more understanding, but when you get to the adult world, you can find all kinds. And that's the, you know, and if you find a doctor who, when you transition, that does not engage with you with conversation, get another opinion. Get another opinion because it's really important. My doctor is as important to me, and I've had him since my early 20s as my husband. And I say that lightly, but it's really important that I have a good communication with him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lori, one of the things that, I personally learned is that, on the pediatric side, when we've had these long relationships, it's difficult for us, our team, to let go. So sometimes we're not oriented to preparing people to let go. But now that, we have learned more, there are more and more transitioning programs. And so if you are a parent of a child that is, still in a pediatric program, these are important questions to ask. And actually, it's never too early to ask. And the reason why I say that is sometimes, if you wait until, somebody is, 2 years away from transitioning or 4 years away from transitioning, and you just start to broach the subject, there's a lot of anxiety. Instead of having practices that incorporate, again, input from the child and with their parent, but more and more as they grow older to get more independence from the child. Um, uh, and I can't say enough about that working well. And then in our program, we would ask the parent to step out. So by the time they were 16 or sometimes before, we would say we're going to have a little private time, and really, work with that child, adolescent, to learn how to advocate for themselves and to ask questions and to be comfortable asking questions. The other thing is really good programs accompany the person who's transferring to the adult care facility, and they find a good match. And we would go to the first few treatments with the patient if they were a hemodialysis patient, but otherwise we would go with them to a transplant appointment and then follow up to make sure that they were successful. That doesn't happen everywhere, but you can certainly ask. You can say, I've heard of programs offering this kind of support. I'd like to know if you can offer that kind of support. For the two people who have commented on your transition experience, it sounds like you learned as adults, what we would call the hard way, but yet you were successful. What do you wish the pediatric program would have? How do you wish you would have been prepared ahead of time, knowing what you know today?
I can jump in because I started when I was a kid. And I have to say the healthcare professionals were my family. They were, yes, you're my family too. But I felt so close to them because I had some dysfunction in my family. And they were always consistent, smart, loving, caring, empathetic, and a lot of my family members had addiction problems. So it comes with unstable, sometimes reactions. And one of the things that was really I struggled as a kid is I often was made to feel like a burden. and feeling like a burden. But I would go to the nurse and they would say, we'll take care of you. And that emotional support that I got from the staff, I really missed it. So I created RSN to keep it intact because that was my family. And I mean, I'm working on a memoir and I'm very self-aware, but I had more renal care professionals at my wedding than my own family. So I think we can't always underestimate the impact when you're a long-term pediatric patient on how that makes you feel. And then secondly, is that uh, when you switch to an adult unit, it's like there's nobody around me. You know, I gotta ring my bell because it's a bigger clinic. And the hardest thing I had going to an adult unit is seeing the older people on the end of their life. That was really hard because we learned to joke about it. That are the firemen cute or picking them up? I mean, there were different strategies, but I hadn't been prepared that a lot of people on dialysis in adult unit are on the end of their life. And I wasn't subject to that too much as a pediatric. And I think being on home dialysis, switching to in-center, which you have to do because of catheters and stuff, not understanding, the different smells. I mean, different smells in different units are very, I mean, I can specifically recall the smell of the pediatric unit to the dialysis unit was much stronger because there were more machines. And so I just wanted to express that. And then one other thing, and I hope it's different today, but people didn't have a lot of expectations of me. And that was probably the hardest thing. And I was like, well, I'll show them. Because they're like, oh, you're never going to get another transplant. Technology wasn't around. So they were like, just continue living your life, but they didn't really talk about going to college and stuff like that. So I think that lack of expectation often, well, I'll show them. I probably just rebelled as a teenager. But I don't know if the other panelists or Helen, if you have any comments on that, but I thought I would bring up about what were the expectations for you, because I think those are important.
I think survival is in the adult world is associated with being able to advocate for yourself, and there are those expectations that you advocate, even if they don't say it. They may not have expectations for you as a human being, but they expect you to initiate conversation with them. And it is difficult because you're going from mostly a pediatric environment. As Lori said, different smells. It might have been decorated differently. It might have been a brighter environment. And then you go to another place where, it looks like, a clinic. It doesn't look fun. So just how you prepare yourself, uh, and how we as practitioners prepare you, so that so in with children. And the reason why pediatrics is different from adult is in pediatrics we're always ready to jump in and advocate, right? Because you may not have had this experience, but there are some children who don't come with a complete family unit. And so in a hospital, legally, we're always jumping in. Let's do this. Let's do this for the family, for the child. Let's advocate. And in the adult world, no matter where you are, that burden is back on you unless you have a unique individual to advocate, because you're going from a mostly nurse-led environment to a mostly technician or medical assistant-led environment. What was your experience? Did anyone have expectations of you? I'm ever hopeful that it's changing, but I'd like to hear from you.
What about you, Mihi?
Okay. So for me, going from pediatrics to adults, when I was in pediatrics, everything, they always, the doctors, the nurses, everybody looked at my mom because my mom's the one who went with me to appointments, to everything. So it was much more difficult because I feel like in adults now I don't need to have my mom in there. So I go to my appointments alone. I do all my things alone by myself, and they look at me. They ask me the questions because before it was her expected out of her to answer all these questions, remember all these things, but now I'm glad to be able to be heard. And at times I have had to advocate for myself to be heard by those physicians or nurses or any of the adults. And now that I go to dialysis, I go to in-center dialysis. I where I went to pediatrics, I feel more like I'm going to like a family kind of like I feel like those nurses, my nurse is like family and my technician is like family because we joke around a lot and I could be myself. And I'm a really talkative person, and I like to get to know people, and I'm outgoing. And yes, I'm the youngest patient in my clinic. I'm the youngest patient. Everybody's older. And at first, when I started in center hemodialysis, it was really scary, intimidating because all these doctors, I was scared if I was gonna be hurt. And because my mom had to come into the first few appointments, and I was scared that, okay, am I gonna, are they gonna listen to me when because they were still expecting her to tell all about my body and all about like my health issues. And when I started speaking, they were like, oh, okay, she knows what's going on in her body, and she knows her mental state, everything, and she knows her medications. It took a while, but I eventually got to know the nurses, the technicians, the administration, and they became family, especially my nurse now and my technicians. They're like family to me, and we joke around a lot. They joke with me, and I feel comfortable. I also got to know the patients around me. Like I said, I'm really talkative and I like to get to know people. I like to ask them what their name is. I like how they're, and some of the older patients, one thing I always get is, oh, you're so young. Are you okay? I'm like, I'm great. I'm just living just one day at a time. I'm doing my best, and I always like to get to know them. So now I've become friends with a lot of the older patients, and it's the thing is it's a lot of difficult when you first start from pediatrics to adults because you don't know where you stand because you're just trying to figure out, okay, am I gonna be taken seriously? At first I wasn't. I had to change a few doctors to be able to be taken seriously by my physician, to be able to be feel comfortable enough to speak about my body, to ask those questions. Because at first, I was told, okay, you know what, dude, those are too much questions. I wanted to feel comfortable enough to ask all the questions in the world without feeling like, okay, am I talking too much? Am I asking too much? Because one thing I would tell people is there's never too much, especially for younger patients. There's never too much questions that you can ask from your physician or from your nurse or from your technician. Ask all the questions that you need to, like, if you feel confused, if you feel like you don't understand something, ask that. And yeah, I
Thank
hope I
you.
answered that question.
No, you didn't. I think you touched on, I love that you touched on, advocating for yourself so much because that is so important and it sounds like you do it very well. So thank you for sharing that. Great advice. Jorge, did you want to add anything?
I think Mihi covered most of it. It's really interesting. I always find it a little unnerving that women have a more difficult time finding a physician who will actually listen. I've heard about this happening a lot within healthcare. but I don't know to what extent it occurs. We're talking, I forgot.
That's okay. Well, I actually have one more
Yeah,
question
go
I
for
wanted
it.
to ask you too. Maybe you could touch on this. Was there an aspect of your care that you found to be like the most difficult, like diet, meds, treatment, anything like that?
The diet for sure, especially dial when I transitioned to adult dialysis, I was only dialyzing 3 hours, 3 times a week. The diet was just so restrictive that honestly, if it weren't for the fact that I was strapped to a chair, I would have strangled my doctor right there. But it's so important. Diet is so important, especially in pediatric. They don't, I remember having a dietitian, she would just tell me, okay, you need to cut back on your phosphorus intake, but she never explained why. What for for someone who is very curious who and or for someone in with a chronic disease, you need to be able to answer what, why, and how. Without understanding those, you really can't take care of yourself. But women in particular are predisposed to bone disease. I'm 37 and I have osteopenia as a result of my phosphorus being uncontrolled through my teen years. Thankfully, there were new phosphorus binders coming out during that time, but I tried my best and I cut back on all of the high phosphorus foods up until those new binders like Fosrenol and Vela came out. And that's when I started to experiment. The other thing was the energy. Um, I don't know how Epigen is administered in a pediatric unit, but in adult units, um, it's apparently managed through an anemia management person, where they just look at the numbers on a screen and they seem to give a, they just give a certain amount that they think is okay. I went a different route. I got tired of the whole yo-yo effect with my Epigen, and I can still clearly remember walking from the scale to my chair and nearly passing out because my hemoglobin was about 8. So I remember calling up my physician and telling him, this is ridiculous. Let's co-manage it. And so we basically, we took, I developed, we developed this relationship and we co-managed my Epigen so well to the point where to date, I don't know of anyone who was able to keep their hemoglobin as close to normal levels while on dialysis as possible. I was around 11 to 12 most of the time. I didn't care that some of it clotted in the machine. I cared more about how I felt because I wanted to feel normal. I wanted to exercise because my body craved it. So it's very important to educate yourself early on to avoid long-term comorbidities.
Thank you, Jorge.
Yep.
And thank you, Mihi, for sharing as well. Helen, I know we're coming to the tail end of your presentation. Are there any other important points that you wanted to bring up or close with, or anything that maybe you've noticed ends up being like the difficult aspects of care for patients?
I think Jorge, mentioned diet. I mean, we all have dietary challenges, no matter, if you don't have a chronic illness, let alone having all of the restrictions of chronic kidney disease. I mean, for me, on the outside looking in, I often think of people that are on dialysis or transplant, just keeping up with innovation and what is available to them, not only what their plan of care is today and how to keep to that plan of care and to get the best advice, but also to ask, is there anything else, on the horizon, and so that whoever your doctor is, they're thinking about that for you, whether it's, a new type of dialysis treatment, a new transplant medication, because sometimes, I see that things just sort of put along, and as long as everything's fine, then it's good. You might not hear about innovation, and certainly there's precious little of it. But when there is, for people with chronic kidney disease to ask, I think that it puts you in the best light.